Good morning, Peter Goertz. I'm a psychiatrist. Were most abusers themselves abused? I can't prove this, but the short answer in my opinion is yes. That's been my impression from many years of being a psychiatrist. One important thing to look at is if an abuser has been abused in the past, it's no excuse for the abuse, of course, for them being an abuser, but it can give you some understanding of where the abuser is coming from, and that may be helpful. The majority of people who've been abused do not go on to abuse others. That's important to look at. If someone is an abuser, though, in my experience, they likely have been abused. So if someone abuses someone else, in my experience, likely they have been abused. So, for example, if a child shows changes in behavior like aggression all of a sudden, maybe they've been abused. So that's something to look into. I was sitting with a patient who'd been sexually abused by her father, and I was saying what I just said, that my impression is that if someone abuses someone else, likely that abuser has been abused. And then, so I was giving that general statement, but then a few minutes later, the patient said something in detail that her father had told her when she was a child about himself having a sexual interaction with his father. So that kind of really struck me because I had given that general statement about my impression that abusers, at least frequently, in my opinion, the majority of abusers have been abused themselves, but then the patient gave that specific example which really struck me. So a general statement is one thing, a specific, with some detail, a statement by a patient that's specific about her life is something different. And patients may wonder if what they've been through is even abuse. And it can be very tricky because a patient may have loved their father, may still love their father who was their abuser, and their father may have loved them or may still love them. So very tricky situation for patients. And it can be very difficult to work on these things for people. A patient of mine years ago had been a sex offender and he'd been incarcerated for many years. And when I was talking with him, he at that point was a little older, in his 50s. And when I was talking with him, he mentioned as a child having had an older boyfriend. He used that term boyfriend, but he was so young that he was a child. So to me, that did not sound like an actual boyfriend, but like someone who was taking advantage of him, like an abuser. Research, in my opinion, can be difficult regarding abuse. Some people may not remember having been abused, potentially from dissociation. And some people may not be willing to answer, may not want to talk about it. And like I mentioned, some people may not see what they've been through as abuse even. So if they're asked about abuse, they may deny having been abused. Another example comes to mind. A patient of mine mentioned that when she was younger than 10, she had had boyfriends who were around age 18. And she used that term boyfriends. So again, the perspective of a patient may not be that it was necessarily abuse. Now, this particular patient, I think in hindsight, did see it as abuse. But it can be difficult for patients to see things as abuse sometimes. Another thing that struck me is sometimes when I read patients' charts, and I read their chart and they were asked about trauma, abuse, and they denied it, But then when I talk with the patient, they do mention the abuse. They do start talking about having been abused. So it may have something also to do with the interviewer. So if a patient senses that whoever interviews them, doctor, social worker, psychologist, if a patient senses that that person really doesn't want to hear about abuse, is not that interested in hearing about abuse, they may not mention it. So that's something that struck me over the years. Sometimes when the chart of a patient has mentioned that the patient denied abuse, when I talk with the patient, sometimes they do start talking about having been abused. A history of having been abused is, from my experience, very frequent in psychiatric patients and also in the general public. You may have had girlfriends who've been sexually abused, for example. Psychiatric disorders sometimes seem to me to be used as terms for people who've actually been traumatized. So let's say someone who suffers from major depressive disorder, some of that may be related to having been abused in childhood, for example. So our DSM-4 terms, DSM-5 terms are diagnoses that we use for psychiatric disorders, may be terms that are being used for people who've actually been traumatized in various ways. And the DSM terms for most psychiatric disorders do not address the causes of those disorders. Thank you.